Good morning. Muy buenos días. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm especially excited because what I'm going to present today and what I've written in the larger essay is brand new. What started as a dissertation project comparing English books of agriculture and Spanish books of mining and metallurgy has, through a kind of alchemical process of its own, now become a book project that looks at imperial overlaps and divergences in metallurgical technologies and vocabularies. And my editor is particularly excited to see how this will be reviewed and received by a community of historians and economic historians, because, as Dennis said, I come from a literature perspective. So thank you all very much for allowing me to kind of test out some new ideas. In the larger essay, I begin by reviewing the language of dominant empirical and Enlightenment discussions of mining and metallurgy, and why it is that there has been a kind of marginalization of some of the early modern treatises that come from the Americas. I'm not going to read that part of it today, but it is in the essay looking at different translations of von Born, the Vienna 1786, the Paris 1788, and then the London 1791 editions. And I talk a little bit about what Tristan Platt and Modesto Bargallo have analyzed in terms of vocabularies that became dominant in the 18th century and were then mapped back onto the early modern period to suppose a kind of empiricism that wasn't necessarily there. Even though, and this is what I'll talk about today, the technologies that they used for metallurgical processing, the methods of amalgamation that von Born talks about, were strikingly similar to what we find in colonial Latin America, where the new method of amalgamating silver was developed. So the point is that even though the technologies and the processes were quite similar, these two different sets of literatures have remarkably different reception histories because of the supposed or the understood epistemological value of each of them. And I think, along with a couple other folks, that this is mostly because of the language in which these treatises are articulated. Right? The early modern treatises come from a position of Aristotelian natural philosophy and Empedoclean root theory that is perceived to have a kind of embarrassingly alchemical inheritance. So quickly, what amalgamation is, as it was developed in the colonies, is a basic 10-step protocol of mineral crushing, sorting into piles, and mixing with reagents, mostly mercury, salt, and a solution of distilled copper called magistral. In the Central Mexican, Andean, and Central European methods alike, the materials were then stomped before the mixture was washed to separate the incorporated mercury from the silver. The unincorporated mercury was removed from the bins to be used again, while the incorporated masses were sent to refining ovens for the final stages of processing. And this was the method developed in the mid-16th century in New Spain. There were some modifications introduced to Alto Peru to control for different mineralogical varieties of silver and also colder ambient temperatures. And von Born also added his own modifications to this process, mostly by replacing the first step of crushing with a dry. It had been a dry process, and he introduced a wet stamp that allowed for the retention of greater quantities of ground material. And he also introduced some mechanized processes. But the basic structure remained the same. But what I really want to talk about today is not necessarily the technology or how this was practiced on the ground, but how this technology was described to people who had never had a chance to see it or understand it, right? How it was that natural scientific writers and vernacular scientific practitioners took the language of their everyday lives and translated them into some very formative expressions that circulated throughout the early modern world. And the language that they used, I'm going to take away all the pretty pictures of the refining ovens, but I'd be happy to talk about different technologies in the question and answer. The language that they used came mostly from this Aristotelian and Empedoclean paradigm, right? A paradigm that was grounded in the idea that all animate beings are composed of different degrees and combinations of the same four roots: water, earth, air, and fire, which represented an especially important concept for Renaissance understandings of material and immaterial similarity and difference, and for the analogical habits of mind that map the workings of the outer world onto the properties of the inner. Understanding how the concepts of likeness and unlikeness, or similarity and difference, were articulated in antiquity by Aristotle and Empedocles will allow us to appreciate the ways in which 16th and 17th century scientific writers and metallurgical practitioners both conserved and reformulated the received wisdom of the past. Because when Empedocles observed that the forces of love and strife motivated almost every human action and informed nearly all of our behaviors, he formulated a set of micro and macrocosmic analogies to suggest that these same forces govern the world entire. According to the Empedoclean tradition, the animate plants, animals, and minerals and waters of the sublunar realm, and the stars, planets, and constellations of the heavens were composed of the same four primary roots, and they followed the same rules of push and pull with like and unlike bodies. So under the auspices of love, two unlike or contrary elements were drawn together into a generative union that would ultimately be corrupted by strife, a divisive force that would tear the pair apart and send each element to take comfort in its own likeness. So love was responsible for the attraction of like to unlike and for the generation resulting therefrom, while strife precipitated the conflict that made like attract like in the act of coming undone. The cyclical flows of these two opposite forces created a delicate cosmological equilibrium. The contrariety of love and strife balanced each other to ensure the continuity of life as a process of generation and coming together that was complemented and completed by the ensuing separation and coming apart. So like both attracted and repelled like, but it was only opposite forces like hot and cold, wet and dry, or male and female that could cause matter to change shape and come into being. And these were the fundamental analogical properties that early modern and medieval writers like Avicenna, Averroes, Roger Bacon, and St. Thomas Aquinas mapped onto the human body by aligning the properties of cold, wet, and dry, and hot with the four humors to explain particular dispositions of children and adults during specific times of the year, and to prescribe medications to treat each resulting condition. When these terms were put into the religio-scientific language of the early modern period, analogy allowed vernacular scientific writers to translate the terms of everyday life into the larger spiritual beliefs and worldly aspirations that they held dear. 16th century miners and refiners in New Spain invented a metallurgical technology that violated these received traditions because they used chemically related silver and quicksilver to cause matter to change shape. And to explain this technique and its theoretical underpinnings to audiences outside of the Americas, early modern writers and metallurgical scientists like Álvaro Alonso Barba, learned in the modes of natural philosophy inherited from antiquity and experienced in the practices of refining in the colonies, sought a language that would allow them to make sense of this apparent contradiction. And they turned, unsurprisingly, to analogy and analogical thinking to provide explanations that allow us now to understand the epistemological sophistication of this new method of amalgamation. And now I want to attend with some detail to the particular language that they use. So to describe the relationship of silver and mercury, writers talk about friendship, right? They say, que hay tanta amistad y analogía, that mercury es tan semejante a la plata. They write, as does the physician Juan de Cárdenas, que esta amistad podemos conjeturar que procede de la gran similitud que estos dos minerales tienen, pues son tan semejantes que en color, en complexión, en peso y apariencia exterior casi no se diferencian. Right? These writers underscore the fundamental similarity or sameness of mercury and silver. And for lettered, learned natural scientific thinkers and practitioners like Barba and Cárdenas, the material technology of amalgamation and the cultural work performed by the language in which the method was explained transformed this friendly sameness, this similarity, this analogía, amistad, into a discourse of desire, appetite, embrace, and penetration, which were the kind of terms, productive and reproductive, typically reserved for the generative coupling of opposites. And so this is the fundamental shift that happens in these treatises. Writers like Barba say that, and here I'm going to read the Spanish, but the English is the first quote. La vicinidad y conveniencia que tiene la naturaleza del estoque con la de los metales bastantemente se manifiesta cuando faltasen otros argumentos por la facilidad con que ellos se unen, los penetra y embebe, convirtiéndolos en que llamamos pella, compañía que con ninguna otra cosa hace. Right, so there's a fundamental convergence of similarity and sameness, but also a process associated with opposites and contrariety that causes matter to change shape. Right? And according to Aristotelian natural philosophy, this kind of thing should not be possible. And yet it's precisely what the writers are explaining in their treatises. Barba's not the only case that we find. Right? Juan de Cárdenas writes, El azoque por la ya dicha amistad se abraza con la plata, using this term of eroticism, embrace or abrazar. Right? Se ha de presumir que se aman y apetecen la plata y el azoque, procurándose, mediante la dicha amistad, abrazar y unir el uno con el otro. And then this is the third quote from Cárdenas. Se echan y incorpora el azoque, a fin de que, como es tan amigo y familiar a la plata, mediante la tal amistad y analogía lo abrace. So it's precisely through this condition of friendship and similarity that enables this move into an erotic register. Now, there would be nothing remarkable about this highly conventional language of love and its attractive virtues, if not for the productive capacity and transformative potential of and into desire that these early modern metallurgical writers located in that friendly similarity. Because sameness and similarity, as philosophers like Aristotle, Cicero, and Montaigne had argued, were the defining elements of friendship in all animate bodies, human, animal, plant, and mineral. But friendly love, or what Montaigne called the sweetest and most perfect fruit of human life, was a sympathetic affinity that, unlike that other licentious Greek love, was decidedly not generative. But the friendship that miners and metallurgists found in colonial Spanish-American silver and mercury proved remarkably effective in causing matter to change shape and come into body as a new form of peya, which was signaled by the eroticism of that verb abrazar. And here we have at the bottom of the page some quotes from Barba. Está en el azoque en su naturaleza, siempre, cuando es de su parte, está dispuesto para abrazar la plata. Right. And I won't read all of the quotes, I've just put a couple of them here. But you can see that this isn't the dominant discourse of these treatises. So if we can learn a great deal about the philosophical underpinnings of this new method of metallurgical processing, this new method of treating silver, by studying the ways in which scientific writers explained this new technology using existing terms, then we can learn even more about the history of the science of silver in the early modern world by studying the transmission and circulation of metallurgical treatises within and across imperial readership communities. In particular, what I'd like to offer today is a close reading of silver treatises written in Spanish for a Habsburg imperial audience that I'll compare with the translation of those treatises into English, since the English were the other major empire responsible for the organization of American space, and in the 17th century, they fashioned themselves in an explicit rivalry with Spain. This comparison, I think, helps us to see which elements of the new method of amalgamation could be easily understood outside of the early Americas, and which concepts made little sense outside of their immediate colonial scientific context. This is because both English and Spanish writers drew from Aristotelian and Empedoclean paradigms. And so we find it was very easy for them to translate terms like elemental fire and sympathy and concepts about purification. But other terms, especially those that were associated with metallic reactions in specific stages of the amalgamation method as it was developed in Spain's American colonies, were more difficult for translators to express with fidelity to their target readers and the source language. The intranslatability of those terms suggests then what was new and not new about the new method of amalgamation, and it points to non-European forms of knowledge and scientific practices that were incorporated into Habsburg imperial metallurgy. And the treatise that I'll be using today is Edward Montague's translation of Barba. Barba's treatise came out in 1640 in Madrid, and the Montague translation came out in 1670 in London and was reissued in 1674 because it sold very well and was quite popular. In the larger essay, I talk about what Montague, who was the Earl of Sandwich and ambassador to Spain, does well in the translation, how he handles the translation of varieties of ore that he could not have possibly known about, things like varieties that were named pacu, or the Quechua term for reddish, because they were mixed with elements of copper, racialized terms of ores that were called castas de metales, like metales mulatos and metales negrillos, which were mixed with iron and sulfur and found at various levels of profundity and exposure to oxygen. But it's not as much fun to talk about what he does well as what he doesn't do well, because I think those are really the moments that we can see new syncretic forms of knowledge emerging from the technology. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. The things he gets wrong. Because when he was tasked with translating passages on the purification of metals or heat-based smelting techniques that used existing logics of sympathy for some resemblance that it had to metal, Montague found the corresponding terms in English, even when he could not have known the specialized varieties of Andean ore that he was describing, and even though he did not have the kind of practical experience that Barba did. But when it came to the key terms of the new method of amalgamation, Montague routinely mistranslated the names of raw materials and the verbs that characterize the union of mercury and silver. English and Spanish share many terms that natural scientific writers could use to describe the interaction of these two materials. Right? They could use less effective verbs and Latinate adjectives like unite or incorporate, or they could talk about something being corrupted or reduced. But instead of these terms, or in addition to them, Montague routinely chooses to translate the verb abrazar, that erotic verb of embrace, with a verb that converts, or that verb that fundamentally converts the scientific ideas of antiquity into a new technology of generative sameness, an idea that marks a fundamentally new way of thinking about what it means to be similar and different. Montague collapses the eroticism of that verb and misses the epistemological sophistication of that process. He also mistranslates nouns that he does not realize are Hispanized versions of indigenous terms, thus allowing us, I think, to identify moments where indigenous vocabularies and indigenous practices are driving this new method of processing silver. And here I'll share two key examples. So this first one is the noun, and then my second case will be the verb. Montague's translation misses these key contributions by confusing Spanish and Quechua terms. So when Barba describes how to add mercury to the bin and how to add it in the quantity such that you won't lose all of the silver that you've been treating for the past 2 weeks, he says, échase azogue suelto, también en la tina, que llaman baño, que cuando se comienza a lavar, incorpórese con el que el cajón tenía, ayuda a recoger, y mientras más fuere menos conchos, causarán. Right. And Montague takes this quite literally and says, he instructs his readers to throw quicksilver also loose into the cauldron, which they call a bath, when it begins to be liquid. Incorporate therewith that which the caxon contained, and it will help to unite it the better. And the more quicksilver there was, the fewer inequalities like oyster shells will be produced. Okay. Conchos technically does mean oyster shells, but there are no oyster shells in a metallurgical vat, right? And there are especially no oyster shells in the inland regions of Potosí and Zacatecas. So what is it that conchos means? Conchos is the Hispanized version of the Quechua term conchu, which is sediment or drag, right? It's the stuff that sinks to the bottom of a bin. So by pointing to the moments when Montague doesn't realize that these terms are non-Spanish, and by identifying these moments of mistranslation, we can see moments in the metallurgical technological processes that are driven by indigenous practices. Right? And this is something that a lot of people have worked on. Carmen Salazar Soler has done really great work in this field. So this method of translation and mistranslation is helpful in part to identify key indigenous contributions to metallurgical practices. But I think that there's something else that we can use with this method of historical linguistics. And this is my second case, which I hope gets at the epistemological contributions of indigenous or syncretic Creole knowledge systems to this radical new technology. So I'm using the same method of looking for translations and mistranslations, and here's what I find. When Barbas talks about the reason why you have to heat certain varieties of silver before you begin the process. Mostly these were varieties like negrillos, the really low-grade varieties of ore. He says, para dos efectos es de importancia el quemar los metales, o para que se muelen más fácilmente, o para disponerlos de suerte que el azogue abrace y se incorpore con la plata que tiene. Which Montague translates as, the burning of ore is useful for two purposes, that it may grind the better, that it may be in better disposition for the quicksilver to lay hold of and incorporate itself with the silver that is in it. So here we have that erotic register of abrazar or embrace, translated in far less erotic terms of lay hold of. And in the second case, we have the term abraza, as be collected together. And throughout Montague's translation, these are the terms that he chooses for the verb. Lay hold of or take hold of, collect together or gather together, which misses, I think, the fundamental idea about the transformation of similarity and difference and this new way of thinking about affinity. So, why does this matter? It's possible that Montague's lack of practical experience or his lack of theoretical grounding in mining and metallurgical science is responsible for the mistranslation of the key verb in the amalgamation method. But that inexperience would not necessarily explain why he gets other nouns, verbs, and adjectives right, the stuff that I skipped over but talk about in the essay, particularly those terms which were rooted in Empedoclean and Aristotelian traditions, or why he recognizes the need to treat terms like rapace and caxen, or paco and negrillo, in different ways. Instead, I believe that he mistranslates abrazar for the same reason that he mistranslates conchos. He does not realize these terms as non-Spanish elements of colonial mining and metallurgy. His failure to recognize the erotic potential of the verb abrazar and the place of that eroticism in the epistemic formulation of amalgamation theories suggests that the conceptual framework of this new mode of metallurgical processing was produced by a knowledge system that was unfamiliar to him. It suggests that this new understanding of the generative potential of sameness emerged from indigenous or syncretic Creole knowledge systems whose natural scientific paradigms and principles did not share a common vocabulary or conceptual framework with early modern Europe. So, historians and historians of science have long recognized the unique demographic conditions of colonial American mining and metallurgy, and they have noted that it cannot be a coincidence that new technologies of amalgamation were developed in the multilingual, multi-ethnic mines and refineries where skilled and unskilled indigenous, African, and European practitioners collaborated and competed under the auspices of Habsburg imperial policies. But it has been difficult to say with much certainty, and here I empathize with Juan about the need for caution, what roles indigenous Creole, and African agents of science may have played in the epistemological roots of this new method. Because, as historian of science Julio Sanchez Gomez has noted, most miners and metallurgists were illiterate, and they left no documentation, in their own words, of their work. And the disciplinary conventions of history make it very difficult to tell a story about someone who didn't necessarily leave a printed record. There have been, I think, very promising archaeological excavations and ethnohistorical oral histories that have shed great light on rich material cultures and legacies about metallurgical practices. But they have revealed far less about indigenous and Creole knowledge systems in colonial Iberian mineralogical science. So the method that I'm trying to propose, and what I've done in the essay, is designed as a kind of experiment to see whether or not we can use translation and mistranslation to show the epistemological sophistications of colonial silver mining and metallurgy, even when they've largely been dismissed by Enlightenment readers and the people who follow them, but also and ultimately the tremendous contributions of indigenous peoples' knowledge systems to the vernacular sciences that were enlisted in the service of the Habsburg and Holy Roman Empires. Colonial silver was by far the largest industry in Spanish America, one whose external consequences or impact on settlement patterns, demographics, artistic productions, and cultural architecture in the colonies, and whose impact on global markets, transportation networks, and economic exchanges throughout the Habsburg imperial world were, according to Peter Bakewell, almost beyond measure. So it seems especially important then that we try to come up with a method that might allow us to measure these contributions. And the method that I've suggested today emerges, I think, in the interstices of historical linguistics, literary scholarship, and translation studies, taking the language of these treatises, which have been ignored by literary scholars because, well, they lack a certain felicity of expression or literary merit, and have not often been studied by historians for their contributions to vocabulary, because those aren't the questions that a lot of historians are interested in asking when they read these treatises. And so what this kind of interdisciplinary method is proposing is, I hope, a way of reading the multilingual remains of the past so that we can appreciate the skilled practices and epistemological sophistications and technical literacies of colonial silver miners and refiners. Thank you.